I've made a video game. It's called Reiterate, and it's out in less than a week. If you look over the entire devlog series up until this point, you might realise that there's nothing else I need to tell you about, other than, suspicious by its absence, a video about fixing bugs. The problem with doing that is that it's not very interesting to watch, and there's not a lot to tell you. Here, I'll run you through a quick fictional example. Oh no. My game is broken. How do I fix my game? I do not understand what is broken. This is an unfortunate happenstance. I have fixed my game. That's exciting. See, it's not exactly compelling content, is it? So instead I thought what we'd do is look over the 16 episodes of the devlog that have led us to this point and see whether or not everything that I said at the time still applies to the game that's coming out on the 13th of January that you've obviously already wishlisted. I want to see whether I really knew what I was talking about and whether I was correct in my philosophy at the time, and also go over any of the lessons that I've learned in actually taking a game from nothing to being on Steam. So strap in, because we're doing the YouTube equivalent of a clip show, which means this series has absolutely already run its course in terms of originality and creativity. That's exciting. Episode 1 was released on the 25th of October 2020, which seems like forever ago. And in that video I said, the goal is to make something small and manageable in scope that I can eventually release on Steam. It has to be a 2D platformer. They are by far the easiest games to design and develop in terms of scope and feasibility, and it's something I feel pretty comfortable putting together. Small and manageable in scope. Easiest game to design and develop. Oh, sweet summer child. I then went on to talk about the inspirations for Reiterate. Kuso and N++, the genre that I referred to as the low-spec platformer. I think Reiterate is in fact still that. What I've always said about the aesthetics is that I wanted it to look and behave like a retro game that came out on a console that never existed. Some kind of nebulous retro philosophy, because I think certain game design principles were done right the first time. Then I had to figure out which mechanics I wanted, and it's interesting looking back now at stuff that doesn't exist anymore. Swimming, lava, jelly floors, giant Crayola spikes, and even checkpoints and vertical levels. They're all dead. All those mechanics. Lost. Like tears in the rain. Oh well. It was then time to deal with my biggest weakness as a game developer. I cannot draw. I've mentioned this a couple of times before, but it bears repeating because really, I can't draw. Sadly, video games need graphics. Don't get me wrong, text-based games are still great, but it's pretty difficult to make a 2D platformer with just letters. Difficult, but not impossible. So what do you do when you need graphics for your video game, but you have the artistic ability of a particularly talentless three-toed sloth? Easy, you cheat. I then went on to explain that I was going to be basically cheating. I called to mind Mike Bithel's Thomas Was Alone as an example of the kind of aesthetic I was aiming for. High contrast, geometric levels that I could replicate in an easy way without having to do anything even approaching actual artistic skill. I think it's fair to say I stuck to this pretty well, and this is another thing that survived the development process mostly intact. At least, the philosophy behind it. During this episode, I also said this. Scaling down for resolutions smaller than 1080p might cause issues when I come to do runtime options, but that's a problem for Future Zane. On behalf of Future Zane, which is me now, I hate you, past Zane. You are a short-sighted, overconfident idiot, and I'm glad you're dead. This is where I locked in the aesthetic for Reiterate, and it's worth noting that I still use a lot of these assets today in the version that's coming out next week. They just look significantly different because I rolled back my stupid 1080p idea, since it was stupid and I was an idiot. I then went on this weird tangent about Jason David Frank from Power Rangers, which I'm going to put in here because I think it's probably one of the best bits of the whole series, to be honest. Imagine that you are the actor Jason David Frank, better known as having played Tommy Oliver in the Power Rangers franchise. And imagine that you, Jason David Frank, have been pulled into a time-travelling wormhole from the year 1993, before you went on to play any roles as either the White or Red Rangers. What if you, Jason David Frank from 1993, are currently the Green Ranger, and you feel underrepresented in the 2D platformers of the year 2020 that you've somehow found yourself in? Well, don't worry, Jason David Frank from 1993. I've got you covered. What did that have to do with game design? Nothing! But I enjoyed it. And teachable moment. It's important to enjoy the process, even if the process is being an old man and just talking about Power Rangers for 10 minutes. What's great is that this episode did actually come with a genuinely worthwhile conclusion. How to make video game graphics when you can't draw. You should cheat as much as possible, be very lazy in exploiting the assets you end up making, use basic geometric shapes that you can manipulate via your engine of choice, and design with a basic understanding of what contrast does to your player and how you can use that to your advantage. Actually created a genuinely educational segment for once. I also didn't do anything to the water because, I mean, how do you redraw water? I don't know yet how that will work with the single colour themes I've got going on, but that's a problem for future Zane. Past Zane was a dick. Episode 3 was all about laying down the type of game that Reiterate would go on to become. And you know what? I totally nailed it. I talked about how Sonic is primarily about speed and Mario is primarily about technique. And although I wanted some speedy elements in my game, Reiterate would actually be what I called a technical platformer. And it absolutely still is. Yes, it has a speedrun mode, but that's a secondary feature to the primary challenge of actually getting through these technically designed levels. Figuring out mechanics and plotting your movement on a moment-to-moment basis to build up familiarity and your own competence. I was right, which is very satisfying. You know what I was wrong about though? Absolutely none of that still exists. I've replaced it with a time-slowing mechanic instead, which is a much more elegant and user-friendly way of doing basically the same thing. In fact, I'd realised my mistake by the time that we got to... I'm making a video game. Last time I decided to make an assist mode for accessibility reasons, and planned out what that might look like. I made a massive mistake and I was an idiot the entire time. What I'd proposed was that you get given the option of an assist every time you die. I also decided that the intent for this game would be to make a challenging technical platformer in the style of Super Meat Boy. What I didn't realise while I was faffing my way through this is that those two things are diametrically opposed to each other. Can you imagine what Super Meat Boy would be like if every time you die the game said, "Hey, you died, do you need some help?" rather than feeling supported? I think instead you'd just feel patronised. That means talking down to people. I then spent most of this video dunking on Watch Dogs Legion for some reason. There was a pretty positive and useful moment in devlog 4 though. Theoretical design should stay fluid until you come to implement that design. While it's a great idea to put your ideas down on paper and to plan out your game with a roadmap so you know where it's going, this should all stay subject to change until you come to actually make the thing. Iterating and reiterating on your design is the best way to test the practical limits of your ideas. As you'll see, I definitely kept to that. So much changed in Reiterate as a result of me actually having to do the things I was talking about, which I think you'll see when you watch the rest of this video. Devlog 4 also begins to illustrate the negative and detrimental effect of one particular nefarious thorn in my side video game. Yes folks, I of course mean Celeste. Celeste's existence has been a blight on Reiterate's development because it's led to so many people thinking that, unfortunately, every single 2D platformer after Celeste should basically just be like Celeste. And this was about the point of the development where I, in a moment of weakness, decided to go along with the general consensus and start slapping in Celeste-like features so that everybody would be happy. Would you like a new and modern and relevant teachable moment that I've learned from recapping all of Reiterate's development? Don't worry about what other people are doing. Seriously, don't. If you have a design direction for your game and you know what you want to do and accomplish, don't go changing it just because someone else has done something else. They're not you. They don't think like you do, and the people who think your game should be more like that game don't yet want your game. Instead, they want more of that game, and you're not making, for example, Celeste 2. This took me a long time to realise, because on the surface it sounds so arrogant. It sounds like I'm saying, I don't need to make Celeste, because I know more than the person who made Celeste, and I can make a better video game than Celeste. And I mean, in some aspects, yeah, kinda. But it's actually more than that. It's about knowing what you want from your game and finding a way to frame that so that it confidently stands apart from the thing that everybody wants you to make. Don't get me wrong, there might be certain aspects you want to keep from that thing everybody won't shut up about. But what's important is that you identify the differences and put yourself right behind them. You have to be your own biggest fan because at this point, you're the only one who knows what the final game is actually meant to look like. And you can lose so much time and mental energy if you give in to what other people think they want, when really, you've got enough to be focusing on by making what you want. Devlog 4 was all about making the most of your own game design. And during that very video, I think I demonstrated that at this point, I really wasn't. I was chasing something else, made by someone else because of something else that someone else had said. And that's just bad for you. So don't do that. A good name accomplishes a few things. 1. It rolls nicely off the tongue and just sounds nice to say. Take Tetris, for example. It's punchy, short and to the point. It's also unique for the time and brands the game with something that can be built on in future iterations, even though that probably wasn't the original intention. Some names evoke a certain time period of gaming and the philosophies attached to them. Super Meat Boy, for example. The original Meat Boy was a Flash game, rest in peace Flash, so when it came to a fully featured sequel, Team Meat added the Super prefix. This is in keeping with the Super Nintendo era, where sequels to NES and arcade games would just slap Super on and call it done. Bringing to mind the Super Nintendo and the early 90s design philosophy sets you up for the nostalgic style of gameplay that Super Meat Boy excels at. Devlog 5 was all about naming the game. I spent 12 whole minutes talking about picking a name for my video game, because if it wasn't already obvious, I clearly enjoy the sound of my own voice. Thankfully, I think. So do you. I called it Reiterate, obviously, and I think what's brilliant about this is that I still do actually like the name. It's not something I got sick of, which I think is the biggest testament to having made the right choice. Well done, me! Devlogs 6, 7 and 8 were all about level design. Before you start designing levels for a 2D platformer, you need to have your mechanics set in stone. It's like trying to build a piece of IKEA furniture. There's no point putting bits together until you know what all the bits are, because if you get that wrong, you'll be on the phone to customer support for 90 minutes trying to get a missing screw for your Kavist Bro, or you'll feel like you've finished and wonder why your Arkelstorp looks like Bumblebee. Your mechanics will guide your level design, so you need to have a thorough understanding of what they let you do. I split this over 3 different videos because it's probably the chunkiest and most in-depth part of making a basic 2D platformer. These are, I think, some of the most educational videos in the series, but more importantly, they're the ones I'd like you to watch the most. Why? Because I'm assuming many of you are game developers yourselves, and I'm really sick of playing 2D platformers that have bad level design. I then invoked the legendary Bob Ross to teach you about my level design process in a way that I think was actually pretty great. In level 1, we used spikes, a spring, and that was it. Those are the colours that we used to build up our painting. So for this level, let's say we're going to use the spikes, the spring, and what I call the spike bar. The next thing Bob does is decide roughly on a theme for the painting. Something like a summer scene, or a forest, or a seascape, or something at night, that kind of thing. Our equivalent goes back to something I introduced in the last devlog, direction. We can go up, we can go to the right, or we can go down. This is also where I introduced and solidified my now infamous philosophy of place and test and tweak. 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 That wasn't the only thing we covered though. We moved into advanced level design philosophy by the time we got to episode 8. In case you ever come into these videos thinking, man, this guy really knows a lot of things, then let me assure you I had to look at whether illusionary was even a word, because I was worried I'd made it up. Thankfully it is, so I guess carry on thinking I'm smart. Illusionary difficulty is where mechanical level design joins with visual design to create a tangible and usually predictable response in the player. We're now into the parts where we're messing with the player's emotions, which is really addictive if you're an egotistical sociopath, and I'll be honest with you, there's worse things for a game designer to be. Episode 8 also features what I consider the best joke in the entire series. Visual hazard placement is a rising, ascending, cumulative one-time deal. Once you've ramped up how difficult your level looks, you can't take it back again, and it's going to get ridiculous. What's worse is that, like those horror games that just bombard you with jump scares, boo, eventually it will stop having any effect at all. In summary, I think episodes 6, 7 and 8 all outline things I still do now. They're things I definitely stuck to in the final game, and the levels are all designed in a meticulous and, I think anyway, absolutely, comprehensively, intentionally brilliant way. But I probably would say that, wouldn't I? I've previously been accused of clickbaiting people with my videos, especially my titles, and I'd just like to say, how dare you? How dare you bring those accusations to me? Yeah, alright, I totally did. A little bit. Kinda. Episode 9 was all about how my game was dead, and deleted and gone and bad, and thrown into the endless void of cancelled corpses. Obviously it wasn't. And it was actually about how I'd moved development over to Construct 3. This was also the first mention of the playable demo build, which would become a recurring theme, and as it turns out, even worse for the game than 50,000 people telling me to play Celeste. On balance though, I am still glad I moved to Construct 3. It wasn't as easy as I thought it was at the time, and brought with it a new and different set of challenges and janky physics. But in the end, it's still been better than outputting anything in ClickTeam Fusion 2.5. To give you a real-time example, in the time that I've moved over, Skira, the developers of Construct 3, have dived deeply into making replicable, accessible 3D features in what is ostensibly a 2D engine that I've really enjoyed playing around with. They release regular bug fixes, there's a beta I think every month, and I think Construct 3 has gone through 3 or 4 stable releases in the time that I've been using it. Click Team, on the other hand, have published Five Nights at Freddy's again, and released exactly the same version of Click Team Fusion 2.5 on itch.io for some reason. Well done guys, very encouraging. Episodes 10 and 11 were both about difficulty, understanding where it comes from and how to design it. We need to start by looking at what difficulty is for, and why we might want to make our games challenging in the first place. Why don't we just let them wander around at their own pace and do whatever they want? What's interesting about going back to these 2 episodes is that the final product, which you're clearly going to purchase on Steam, follows this stuff almost to the letter. But, as we've discussed, Mega Man is arranged in what we call uniform difficulty. So how do we apply this to something like Reiterate, which instead uses ascendant difficulty for its progression? Well, broadly speaking, Reiterate's difficulty graph will look like this. That's right folks, I am modelling Reiterate's difficulty pacing on the stock prices of GameStop. What's going to happen is that there will be points, possibly every 5 levels or so, although it's not quite so rigid, where the difficulty will increase pretty sharply. But once the player gets used to those, they'll have the time and space on some subsequent levels to enjoy that growth they've just been through. The idea is that the player's corresponding skill level, for the reasons I've outlined before, is going to look roughly like this. Once you've figured out how you'll be setting up your player's loops, we need to know what to fill those loops with, and that brings us to chunks. There might be some other term that people use for this, but I like chunks because it sounds satisfying and, well, chunky. A chunk is a singular piece of level design that constitutes the player, a goal, and one or more hazards. The simplest example is something like a death pit in Mario. You need to get from here to over there, and there's a hazard down here that you need to overcome. This is a single chunk. It has a start point, a destination, and something trying to stop you. How you build these chunks and how you subsequently arrange them in your level will determine what the player needs to do in a single loop, which will subsequently determine the difficulty curve of your game. It's nice to know that over the course of development I never lost my core focus on how and what I wanted the game to be. It still very much is that, and it's also nice to know that I still absolutely believe in everything I said back then. It's nice to know I was right. I'm not going to go over episodes 12 and 13 because one was a Q&A that isn't really relevant anymore, and the other was an entire episode dedicated to releasing. It was at this point that I released a playable alpha build of what I'd done so far, and everything fell apart. The alpha build was the biggest lesson I've learned this entire time, and it's all to do with personal expectation and the degree to which I lean on audience input and feedback. Specifically, I don't anymore. In fact, during episode 14, I talked about how to take feedback and criticism with a lot of lessons that I was, in the background, absolutely ignoring. If you try and please everyone with anything that you're creating, that will involve removing anything contentious or that puts off even a single person, and that will result in you making something that is inoffensive, unchallenging and bland. Basically beige, but as a creative output. And I've often said before that being a bad game isn't the worst thing that a game can be, because a bad game can still take risks or try new things that might be interesting, even if they don't work. The worst thing that a game can be to me is boring, and when you're trying to please everyone, that's where you'll end up. It's sort of like how you can be really good at giving advice to other people, but then you're really bad at taking your own advice. That's what I was doing. Then I disappeared. For 6 months. I've already covered what happened there, but the short version is that I just hated everything that Reiterate had become. I was miserable, trying to mine away at the 6 billion problems I thought the game had. I had in fact completely lost sight of what I set out to do in the first place. And then, I found it again. It's all gone quite quickly since I decided to come back to it. Episode 15, which was also kinda clickbaity but really not, details everything that changed to get Reiterate out of the void and back into development. I'm not going to cover too much of that because it's stuff that you'll see in the final game anyway, but the basic takeaway is that I had to do a lot of soul searching and cut back even harder than I had before. I took what I thought was already a minimal scope and minimised it even further. And now the game is actually coming out, which is great, I think. The first proper devlog back after everything changed was all about sound and music, which is brilliant because I didn't do it. Instead, I talked about Clone 13, who provided the excellent soundtrack for the game, and how I, as a bit of a hack, cobbled together sounds that served a specific purpose in the final game. It was all very back to normal, and it felt really good to just be back to making good things again, and not cancelling my game or vanishing into the ether for the 17th time. And that brings us to now. The game is done, it's releasing in less than a week, and I am filled with a mix of emotions over the fact that you are all finally going to get to play it. I've learned a lot of lessons. The main one being, in the words of the great philosopher Mufasa, remember who you are. The overall story behind Reiterate's development is one of self-confidence. It started really high, possibly too high, to be honest. Even though I knew what I was trying to make was meant to be small, simple and easy to manage, I still dramatically underestimated the amount of work that it would take to get that project finished. I know this channel is called Let's Talk Game Design, and I think over the course of the devlog series I've done a pretty good job of getting my philosophy out to you. I've backed up my points really well, given relevant examples, and so much of the final product is filled to the brim with things that I think are just good design choices. But that's not all there is to this. It's all well and good to talk about game design, to have opinions and philosophies, and YouTube is filled with thousands of very talented video essayists who will spend hours at a time splurging their unsolicited opinions into the unconscious void. But so many of those choices can fall into a ditch at the side of the road when you come to actually implement them, or re-implement them, over and over and over and over. And there, my self-confidence plummeted, where the ideals of the theory bumped up against the harsh reality of the practice. Game design is an art form, but game development is a science, and getting the two to mesh together in a satisfying way can be a harrowing and soul-destroying experience. But if you're lucky, and your resolve is strong enough, then you'll rediscover the values that drove you to begin in the first place, and your self-confidence and your sense of self will come back to you. And then if you're very lucky, that'll be enough to push you over the finish line to release something that, regardless of whether or not anyone even plays it, you can be proud of. I began this entire process as a person with ideas, theories, confidence, and over the course of this whole development process I had to lose all that so that I could find it again. But it was stronger, harder, faster. Daft Punk titles. In short, I had to, well, you know. Whatever point you jumped in on this journey, thank you for sticking with me through the whole thing. I genuinely can't wait for all of you to play the game, but even if you don't, if you can't, for whatever reason, then I hope that this series has been entertaining or educational, or in some way just good for you. It's certainly been good for me, and I think in the end, I'll be proud of what I can put out. And all that's left for me to say now is that if you like this video, then you should probably like this video, and then subscribe for more videos like the video you liked, since you liked this video and want more videos like the video you liked, which is why you liked it. And I'll see you the next time I'm thinking, hey, let's talk game design.